And spin, spin, spin. And here we go. So we were talking about what it's like to live in layers and streamlining moving fluids. And we'll come back to that. I want to talk a little bit about moving fluids in life, as it were, and introduce a couple of topics. One of them is what we call incomplete fluids that behave in a well-behaved mathematical form that's fairly easy to understand are sometimes called Newtonian fluids. And these are fluids that have a well-defined viscosity, that have a boundary layer you can calculate, that basically behave according to some math worked out by Isaac Newton. One of the conditions for being one of these ideal fluids is being incompressible. And under the conditions that organisms experience, water is practically incompressible. You can't shrink water down. Even water at the very bottom of the ocean, water that's what, 36,000 feet down, is being pressed upon by 35,000 feet worth of water, and it still has a density pretty close to the density of water at the surface. It is very difficult to put enough pressure on water to significantly change the volume that it takes up. And you can't shrink water's volume by making it flow, at least under the conditions that organisms experience. You could probably do it in a sufficiently well-equipped engineering lab, but under the conditions that life can persist in, you can't compress water, and you also can't rip a hole in water. It is, as we say, continuous. You actually can at really high speeds. If you're doing something like designing a turbine jet or a turbine to power a submarine, it's possible to get the rotors spinning so fast that they tear vacuum bubbles in the water. You actually don't want that to happen because that creates noise and puts wear and tear on the rotors. That's called cavitation. That's the kind of thing that, if you're engineering, propellers or something like that, you have to worry about that. But there's virtually no living things that encounter conditions like this. The only one that I can think of is the so-called pistol shrimp, with a claw that's specially modified such that when the shrimp clicks its claw in a particular way, it actually is capable of tearing a vacuum bubble in the water, which promptly explodes and gives off shock waves that stun anything that gets too close. Other than that, for practical purposes, you can't rip a hole in water under the conditions that the vast majority of living things ever experience. There's no fish that can swim fast enough that it can leave a vacuum behind. Water will always flow around it and fill in the space where it was. Pretty straightforward there, but just something I wanted to make clear. And these have implications for living things, including moving fluids flowing through life in situations called hydrostats, which I'll show you in just a bit, and in flow-through tubes. Many organisms are more or less tube-shaped or live in tubes. And it also has implications for the force of lift, which is what keeps airplanes in the air, but also plays a role in the case of organisms in water. So let's start with hydrostats. There are a lot of marine animals that have basically two muscle types, circular muscles working against longitudinal muscles. Longitudinal muscles run from from head to tail or from mouth to butt, whatever the anatomy might be. And circular muscles wrap around the diameter of an organism. We have circular muscles and longitudinal muscles. And these both make up part of the organism's body wall, and they surround a big fluid-filled space. And muscles like this are very often associated with a big liquid-filled cavity called a hydrostatic skeleton. In a lot of worms, the hydrostatic skeleton is a big, empty, fluid-filled space that the gut is suspended in. In burrowing sea anemones, the hydrostatic skeleton is the gut. In burrowing clams and things like that, the hydrostatic skeleton would be blood-filled cavities called a hemocoel. For our purposes, it's all the same. The point of all of them is that you can't compress water, and you can't compress, these other liquids, which are mostly water. And that means if you have an animal that's basically a bag of liquid, the volume can't change. So what that means is that up at the top, there's a kind of imaginary worm where the circular muscles have contracted fully. They're circles that have shrunk down as far as they can go. And if the animal gets thinner, it is forced to get longer because you can't pack down the fluid that's filling it into a smaller volume. You can't compress their bodily fluids. You could test this and see this for yourself just by playing with a water balloon. If you took a long water balloon and you squeeze it with your fingers, either the balloon pops, or if it doesn't pop, it has to get longer, right? If you squeeze it at one end, it has to lengthen at the other end. And if you squeeze it all along its length, you force it to lengthen. So that's what's happened up at the top. The circular muscles are completely contracted, and that forces the longitudinal muscles to stretch out because it forces the worm to get longer. And then C, the opposite has happened. If you contract the longitudinal muscles, the worm gets shorter, but because the volume has to stay constant, as the worm gets shorter, the worm also gets thicker, and those circular muscles are stretched out. Remember that a muscle can't lengthen itself. All that a muscle can do is contract, and then if a muscle relaxes, another muscle has to stretch it, has to make it longer. Muscles don't stretch themselves. So in human anatomy, we talk about opposing muscles. If you just take your arm and you hold it out and then you flex, right? You make a muscle, like that, like Hulk Hogan showing off those 24-inch pythons. Your biceps bends your arm at the elbow. And then if you extend your arm, your biceps relaxes, but your biceps can't get longer by itself. What happens is that a muscle on the other side of your arm, your triceps, has to stretch, and that's what extends your arm. Sorry, your triceps has to contract. That extends your arm and stretches your biceps, right? So when your biceps is contracted, your triceps is stretched. When your triceps is contracted, your biceps is stretched. The two muscles are opposed to each other, and they're opposed to each other, and they can work that way because they're pulling on your skeleton, right? They're pulling on the same set of bones. It's the same idea here in that when one of these sets of muscles contracts, the other one is stretched. The difference is they're not attached to bones, they're attached to a big internal bag of liquid, which we call a hydrostatic skeleton. So even though it's not a bony skeleton, it provides rigidity to the animal, just like a full water balloon is firm. And it also provides something that opposed groups of muscles can work against. And this is what allows a lot of marine invertebrates to burrow. What's going on here is that in picture A, over at the left, the rear part of this imaginary worm, the circular muscles have relaxed and the longitudinal muscles have contracted, so the back end of the worm is getting shorter and thicker. And because it's getting thicker, it's pushing against the sediment, the stuff that looks like graph paper that represents the mud that the worm is pushing through. And because it's pushing against the sediment, it keeps the worm from sliding backwards. So the front end of the worm here is very narrow, and the circular muscles are contracting, which means that the front end of the worm becomes narrower, and it also must get longer. Now it gets longer, and that penetration anchor in the back is keeping it from slipping backwards, so it's forced to push forwards into the mud. And then B, the process is reversed. The head of the worm swells up. The longitudinal muscles contract, which means the circular muscles expand, and the front end of the worm gets thicker and holds the worm in place, while at the back end, the longitudinal muscles contract and the tail of the worm gets pulled towards the head. And then the worm will repeat that cycle, alternating swelling up its back end to push against the sediment while pushing its front forward, and then swelling up its front end to hold it in place while pulling in its rear. Repeat that cycle and you have burrowing. This is how a lot of worms and also a lot of things like marine clams burrow in soft sediment, using those two different groups of muscles working against a hydrostatic skeleton. Burrowing clams do this too. A clam has various organs and things like that, and then a big muscular part of the clam's body that can stick out between the two valves of the clam is called the clam's foot. The foot is the chewy muscular part that you eat if you've ever had clam chowder, if you've ever had, a clam bake, real steamed clams or something like that. The chewy part of the clam that you feed on is mostly the foot muscle. Clams also have a muscle that pulls the two valves together and shuts them together. It's called the adductor muscle. That's labeled over on the upper left. The adductor muscle is the part of the clam that you eat if you're eating scallops, for example. The meaty part of a scallop is the big adductor muscle. Scallops don't have much of a foot, but most clams do. And what they'll do is push the foot forward and then let the tip of the foot swell up to push against the sediment, and then contract muscles to pull the rest of the clam in after the foot. They actually do the same kind of cycle that we talked about in the first slide, and they're able to do this because that muscular foot contains blood-filled spaces and acts like a hydrostat. Okay, so hopefully you get a sense for how this applies to a lot of different marine invertebrates. This is one you can sometimes find in muddy, shallow areas. Eurechus calpo is affectionately known as the innkeeper worm. This one's being kept in a tank with a glass partition in it, so you can see how it's burrowing. And you'll notice it's got kind of a swollen head and then a narrow part back of the head. What this worm's able to do is use waves of contraction passing along the body. So at any given moment, you'll see a couple of narrow areas that are slowly moving down along the worm's body. That's called peristalsis. It's the same kind of wave contraction that your esophagus and intestines use to push food through. It's happening, over the entire body surface of the worm instead of, just on the surface of your intestines or something like that. And Eurechus calpo can use these waves of peristalsis to build a burrow, and it also slowly pumps water through its burrow. The burrow is shaped like a letter U. It's got two openings, and the peristalsis can be used to slowly pump water into one opening and out of the other. That brings the worm fresh oxygen, and it also traps food particles that the worm can feed on. So very sophisticated burrower here, Eurechus calpo, one of the more Freudian of invertebrates. Incompressibility also affects flow through pipes. If you look over here at the left, in light purple, that's a pipe, and there's kind of a darker purple cylinder inside. That represents the amount of fluid that flows past a point in 1 second. Right? If you imagine just watching fluid flow through a pipe, you could mark a spot on the pipe and then hit a stopwatch and measure the amount of fluid that goes past that point in 1 second. All right, so that darker shaded cylinder, it's labeled A sub 1, is an imaginary plug of fluid. It's all of the fluid that flows past point 1 in 1 second. Okay, now imagine the pipe gets narrower. You can't compress fluid, at least not under ordinary conditions, so that plug of fluid A1 has to get narrower, and that means it has to get longer. That means that that longer cylinder, labeled A2 over there on the right, that is the fluid that's going to flow past point number 2 in 1 second. And you see it's more elongated. That means the fluid has to travel farther in the interval of 1 second. What that means is that flow speeds up. This is the point of things like nozzles on a hose. Water might be flowing fairly slowly through a large hose, but if you make the outlet of the hose more narrow, then the water has to go faster, right? To get the same volume of water passing out of the hose at the same time, the water has to speed up. And I assume that most of you have watered plants at some point, and you know the trick. If you're got your garden hose turned on and you're watering plants and you need the water to flow farther, you stick your thumb in the outflow of the hose, right? You've just made the exit of the hose more narrow, and that means that the water has to speed up, which means the water goes farther, which means you can stand where you are and water a much more distant plant. I assume you've all played with this at some point. If not, go outside and do it the next chance you get. This even applies to things like flows through river channels. Where a river channel is wide, it tends to be slow. But if you have a river that's fairly wide and then it narrows, maybe because it has to flow through some hard rock or something like that, the narrow parts of a river channel are the parts where you get the white water, the parts where you get the flow speeding up. So if you've ever gone whitewater rafting, you've probably encountered places where the river is wide are places where you can kick back and get a beer. And places where the river narrows are the places where you speed up and the real fun begins, and you better not have drunk too much beer. Right? So it applies to river channels, it applies to garden hoses, and it applies to organisms. If you have a pipe that branches or forks, the flow speed is proportional to the total cross-sectional area of the branches. Think about human anatomy for a minute. Blood is pumped by your heart, and it leaves your heart through a very big blood vessel called your aorta. And I can't remember, it's been measured. I can't remember exactly how fast blood flows through your aorta, but it's something on the order of 1 meter per second. It's fast enough that if you're in surgery and your aorta gets stabbed, it's going to gush blood for a couple of feet. You might end up spraying the walls of the operating room. Hopefully the surgeons will fix that very quickly. But yeah, blood flows pretty fast through your aorta. And then your aorta branches into a bunch of arteries, and those arteries branch, and they branch, and they branch again. And you end up with a bunch of very tiny blood vessels called your capillaries. And think about it, if you get a paper cut on your finger, as I assume you all have at some point, you cut through those capillaries, right? But blood from a paper cut on your finger does not shoot out of your body at more than 1 meter per second, right? Blood from a paper cut does not splatter on the opposite wall, ew. Blood from a paper cut oozes out very slowly, right? Slowly enough that you can quickly, grab a Band-Aid and put on it and you'll be fine. So blood is moving through your capillaries much, much more slowly than it's moving through your aorta. And the reason is the cross-sectional area of your aorta is roughly the size of an egg roll, maybe a little right where it comes out of the heart, maybe 1 inch in diameter, maybe a little more. It probably depends on the person, but roughly 1 inch. So roughly the size of one of those fried egg rolls or fried burritos that you get at the gas station. The cross-sectional area of all of the capillaries in your body is something like 20,000 times the cross-sectional area of your aorta. So blood goes through your aorta very fast. By the time it's going through your capillaries, it goes much more slowly because it's passing through a much, much larger total cross-sectional area. So blood slows down in the capillaries, which is important because it needs to slow down in order to transfer oxygen and pick up carbon dioxide efficiently. So that's a benefit of having that kind of circulatory system, is that your blood slows down a great deal in the capillaries, because the same volume of blood that every beat of your heart pumps is passing through capillaries that have a total cross-sectional area that's much, much greater than the branches is. Okay, I hope that made some kind of sense. I would encourage people to go out and test some of the things that I say, but please don't go giving yourself paper cut just to see what I'm talking about. The principle is put to very good use in some of the simplest animals in the ocean. These are sponges. And in these sponges haven't got a nervous system or anything really in the way of organs. They take in water through pores in the sides that you can't clearly see in this picture. They're pores called ostia. They filter that water internally. They are terrific at filter feeding. They pick up little bacteria-sized food particles, and the filtered water is ejected out through that hole in the top, almost like smoke coming out of a smokestack. That hole on the top is called the osculum, by the way. In the most complicated type of sponges, don't worry about this name, they're called Lucan sponges. Canals lead in, and the canals that carry water in branch and branch and branch, and they carry water into structures called choanocyte chambers. These are places where specialized cells beat their little flagella and move the water past while filtering out tiny food particles. Why does this matter? Water comes in through those ostia, those little holes in the sides, at roughly 7 millimeters a second, and it passes through the ostia into canals called incurrent canals. And those branch and they branch and they branch and they branch. And by the time the water is passing through the choanocyte chambers where the filtration is happening, the water is moving at 0.5 millimeter a second. It's been slowed down immensely because it's passing through choanocyte chambers whose total cross-sectional area is hundreds of times greater than the ostia. And then the same phenomenon happens in reverse, and by the time that water is passing out of the osculum, it's moving a lot faster now. So this incompressibility of fluid, and the fact that flow through pipes is proportional to the total cross-sectional area of the pipes is made use of to make sponges very efficient filterers. Just by having that very highly branched anatomy, they can pump water to come in rapidly and leave rapidly, but slow down immensely in the middle. And it's the same basic engineering principles behind your own circulatory system, that blood goes through the heart very fast, but slows down a great deal when it's going through your capillaries. So there. Every so often, the stuff that we cover here has very definite relevance to areas of biology that you might not suspect. Everything is connected. Knowledge is all one. Okay, right. Okay, you can see this, and I'd normally demonstrate this in person, but take a sheet of paper sometime and hold it up in front of your mouth. Hold it up with the edge of the paper facing your mouth, so the paper kind of hangs down over your chin. But hold it up with the, here's a, I don't know if anybody can see me doing this, but I've got a paper towel right here, and I'm going to hold it up right at my lower lip and blow. And what I trust you see is that the paper towel rises. There we go. If I blow hard, I can really get it flapping. That's an illustration of something called Bernoulli's principle, worked out by a Swiss physicist back about 300 years ago named Daniel Bernoulli. And he showed that the pressure on a surface that's exerted by a moving fluid is inversely proportional to the speed of flow. So still water or still air on top of something exerts pressure on it. Right, atmospheric pressure is 14 pounds per square inch. So, you know, your entire body and everything in the atmosphere is being pushed down on by the air above you at a pressure of 14 psi, if memory serves. But if we make that air start moving, the pressure on that surface becomes less. Once I made that air move over the paper towel, there was less air pressure pushing it down, and so the paper towel rose. There we go again. There we go. Right. So the pressure on a surface exerted by a moving fluid is inversely proportional to the flow speed. This is a partial explanation of how airplane wings generate lift. Either the shape of the airfoil or the angle that the airfoil is placed relative to the wind direction, or both. Both of those cause air to go faster over the upper surface of the wing than the lower surface of the wing. So here we're looking at a wing in cross-section. And if you imagine air flowing through some little imaginary tubes over the wing, Actually, you could visualize this. Imagine that each one of these black lines is a little smoke stream made by, a maybe very tiny stick of incense or something. And each one of those streams is flowing over the wing. The tubes get narrower when air is deflected over the wing, and what that means is the speed is increased. So air is flowing over the surface of a wing faster over the top than it is over the bottom. That creates low pressure above the wing and higher pressure below the wing. And the effect of that is to pull the wing upwards into the air. For that matter, you could think of a propeller as being like 2, 3, or more wings, except instead of going up, they're being spun, and the force that they generate doesn't pull the propeller upwards, it pulls it sideways. It pulls it in, the forward direction. And in that case, we'd call that force thrust. But it's the same basic idea that propeller is basically a bunch of wings that have been made to spin. But they generate force by the same basic mechanism. And incidentally, since air pressure is lower above a wing than below it, that actually pulls air around the wingtip. If you've flown in some of the latest airliners recently, you might have noticed that there's little winglets at the tips of the wings, little places where the tip of the wing points up rather perpendicularly. That is to avoid a problem caused by what are called vortices. If you have high pressure air below the wing and low above, the high pressure will get sucked around the tip of the wing into the low pressure area. That creates, remember, a vortex is a spiraling region of airflow, and sometimes you can see it. There you've got a plane that has just taken off, and in its wake, you can see a couple of vortices. Those vortices not only decrease efficiency of the wing, they can actually create hazards. At a busy airport where a lot of airplanes are flying, taking off and landing from the same runway in the same direction, airplanes may encounter the vortices left by airplanes that took off before them. That's called wake turbulence, and it is potentially dangerous. You don't want to have a lot of turbulence right as you're taking off or right as you're coming into land. That's the last time when you want to have, air turbulence. That's the last time when you'd ever want to hit an air pocket, as they call it. Okay, so how does this apply to living things in the ocean? Remember that air and water are both fluids. They're both close to being ideal Newtonian fluids, and that means the same basic principles apply in both. The same things that make an airplane wings generate lift make the lifting planes of a submarine generate lift. Submarines use little horizontal wing-like extensions that they can change the angle of in order to generate lift and go up or dive down. Sharks, it's the same thing. Sharks don't have a gas bladder, so sharks will sink if they don't keep swimming, and which means sharks have to constantly push themselves up because otherwise gravity would slowly pull them down. Now, the tail of a shark is actually designed in order to force water downwards in addition to backwards. So as a shark swims, its tail is pushing it up. But when a shark is swimming level and then rises, rises from the depths to, eat a helpless swimmer or something like that, the shark will hold out those pectoral fins, the wing-like fins, just below the gills that it's holding out almost horizontally, and it will angle those fins in order to generate lift, and the shark can rise more efficiently with its pectoral fins angled like that. They work like They work like stubby wings. There are times when lift isn't desirable. That's a flounder. This is a bottom-dwelling fish, and you'll notice that it's got a very low and very rounded profile. If you have currents passing over the bottom, the currents will speed up as they go over the top of the flounder, just the way they speed up as they go over the top of an airplane wing. That means that the flounder experiences a force tending up to pull it up and off the bottom. And if the flow is fast enough, the flounder may actively have to dig in if it's trying to hold still. The flounder may have to use its muscles to push itself down onto the ocean floor. And if it gets really bad, the flounder might have to take off and go swim somewhere else and find a more sheltered spot. So sharks might make use of lift. Flounder might have to fight lift. And there's even some marine critters that use lift for feeding. I assume you've seen sand dollars, maybe at souvenir shops in Florida and something like that. And their skeletons are, usually bleached to a brilliant white. People who've never seen a live one don't realize that living ones are covered with many thousands of very short, very thin spines. And the spines are not white. They're often, in this case, they're kind of purplish. In others that I've seen, they're brown. And the whole thing has a kind of velvety appearance. So these are what live sand dollars look like. This particular one is one from the Pacific coast that I've seen in places like Baja California. It's called Dendraster eccentricus. And to feed, it sticks itself into the sand but leaves most of its body sticking up. These are live Dendraster in feeding position, and these are shaped like a wing like the flounder, with a low rising surface and a flat surface. And when they stick themselves up like this, edge onto the current, they can actually use lift vortices not to take off, but those vortices tend to bring food particles to the mouth. So Dendraster is shaped like a wing, shaped like an airfoil in cross-section, not because it flies, but because it can make use of the vortices that are generated by a lifting wing. And that is my tale of life in moving fluids and moving fluids in life. That's what I've got. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording if you'll give me a minute. And where's the thing to click? There. And I'll stop recording right now.